It's not that we suddenly discovered money lying around on the beach and said, wow, this is valuable stuff you can buy stuff with. We had to construct it. Nor did we find norms lying around on the beach or in heaven and then say, wow, we can make use of these. We constructed them. As I said earlier, Hume's great insight is that not only are we natural artificers, but the greatest artifact we ever constructed are ourselves and the normative structures that make it possible for us to exist.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor J. Garfield. He is Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Smith College and Harvard Divinity School and Professor of Philosophy at Melbourne University. His work has focused on Buddhist philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ethics, cross-cultural work, and more. His books include, among others, The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, Losing Ourselves, Learning to Live Without a Self, The Meaning of Life, Perspectives from the World's Greatest Intellectual Traditions, Engaging Buddhism, Why It Matters to Philosophy, and Norms and Nature, Humean account of the sources of normativity. And that last book is going to be our focus for today. But feel free to add anything. But with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Garfield.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real joy to be here.
Awesome. So as I said, we'll be discussing your recent book, new book called Norms and Nature, a Humean account of the source of normativity. And I'll include links to where people can find that in the description on OUP or Amazon or wherever that can be found. But to start off, can you give a bit of an overview of the book? What is it about, and why might someone look to read it?
Yeah, I'm asking the question, what kind of beings are we? And where does our allegiance to norms come from? Human beings are unique among species in that we recognize norms, take ourselves to be bound by them, find ourselves instituting them and enforcing them. And those include a wide range of norms. The most obvious ones might be ethical, political, and legal norms, but we also endorse epistemic norms, norms of reasoning, norms of getting information, norms of etiquette, how we behave with one another in ordinary interactions, norms of language, using words properly, using grammar properly, and so forth. Now, there's a question about where norms come from. And philosophy has been fairly uniform in the last, say, 60, 70 years in what I would call a neo-Kantian move that came from the great work of John Rawls and Christine Korsgaard and others, who argue really that norms have a kind of transcendental basis, that there's something about what it is to think or what it is to be human that puts us in direct touch with ethical norms, with epistemic norms and so forth, and that they somehow come from without us and that we're bound by them and take ourselves to be bound by them. I think that that's problematic. And it's problematic because it makes it impossible to understand how to integrate our normative nature with our scientific understanding of the world. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to show that Kantian picture is fundamentally misguided, that it's effectively theology in disguise, and that the only way that we can understand how we both have evolved to be a normative animal and how we each grow up as children and are enculturated into norms is to look at this more naturalistically, more in the way that David Hume looked at it than Immanuel Kant. And so to talk about the evolutionary history of norm-governed behavior, as well as the developmental psychology of normativity. I also try to show that even though there are many kinds of norms, again, linguistic norms, epistemic norms, legal norms, ethical norms, norms of etiquette, and so forth, they're not unrelated. They form a kind of unity. And the unity that they form is grounded in our ability to recognize regularities in one another's behavior, to conform ourselves to those regularities, to punish those who violate those regularities, but also, and I think most importantly, grounded in our innate, evolutionarily determined tendency to trust one another. And I think that what's at the bottom of normativity is the fact that as members of species Homo sapiens, we trust one another in countless daily moments. And that trust requires that we regard others as respecting the same kinds of norms that we respect. That's the general idea.
Yeah, good. So yeah, a couple of the main issues that you brought up there we're gonna focus on for sure. One being this, well, what are the nature of norms? Is it some sort of transcendent, quote unquote transcendent view, the right approach, or something else? And then this question of what are the relations between different quote unquote norms? Are they can we give some sort of unified account? Because I don't know, it's when I think about all the different sorts of norms, some of them seem a bit more tied to current practice and convention, almost like certain activities or things that we've developed, and some of them seem less so. And it's not clear to me that there's, well, at the outset, that I would expect there to be some sort of single account for normativity across the board, even though maybe there's some commonalities like that you pointed out, like reactive attitudes and certain expectations and so on. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe just on that point, can you talk a bit more about the idea that there's a sort of unified picture of normativity rather than maybe separate accounts for the different sources?
Sure. Let's take an analogy here that I think is very apt and that also is part of the whole normative domain. Let's think about languages. English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, Japanese, they have very different syntax. They've got very different vocabularies, very different pragmatics even. Nonetheless, we know that each of these has to conform to universal grammar in order to be a learnable natural language. So if we were to look at languages locally, we'd say there's an enormous difference among languages. And somebody who speaks English can't necessarily speak Japanese. Somebody who grows up speaking Japanese may not be able to speak English. Nonetheless, in learning these languages, we all conform to this universal grammar that makes it possible to learn languages. I think about normativity in the same way. Norms of etiquette differ dramatically from culture to culture. Ethical norms differ somewhat, but not nearly so much. Linguistic norms, as we've just noticed, differ widely. Some norms are only applicable if we're part of a voluntary practice, like, say, playing chess or playing football. And when we do that, we commit ourselves to the norms governing those things. Just as if I choose to speak Italian, I've got to govern my behavior to the rules that govern spoken Italian. Or if I decide to go to China, I have to govern my etiquette by the rules of etiquette appropriate in China, not those appropriate in Australia. The point, though, is that just as languages, despite all of their surface variation, have a common underlying structure, norms, despite all of their surface differences, and those are very real and very important, nonetheless have a common underlying structure. The common underlying structure is reflected in our mutual expectations of one another to follow those norms, a general disposition to trust others to follow those norms, a willingness to enforce those norms when necessary, and a feeling that somehow violation of those norms is problematic and something wrong, something that if we do it, we feel characteristic kinds of emotions, characteristic kinds of aversive feelings that kind of bring us back into the space of normativity. So when I talk about the variation, I think that's real. Norms of etiquette are nowhere near as stringent as moral norms. Legal norms are very stringent wherever they apply, but are different in different places, and so forth. So there's a great deal of variation, but the variation is variation within a common structure. And again, what I want to point out is that it's not as though there are other species that have some of these kinds of normativity, but not others. So you might expect if norms were completely independent, that you'd have species that recognized linguistic norms, but not moral norms, or moral norms, but not legal norms, and so forth. But we don't find that. Human beings are socialized into normativity per se, and that manifests itself in all of these different specific domains in which normativity is realized.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I could see someone saying, though, that like, okay, you bring up the certain structures to norms having to do with there being certain expectations and maybe certain reactions and reactive attitudes. connected with norms and following them or breaking them. But, well, maybe that's, like someone could say, that's the case, but all the same, the explanation or source for the different sorts of normativity are different, even though they share these features in that way. Do you see the idea there? Like, what do you think about someone who just sort of bit the said,
That's right. I think that's right, but we need to distinguish two kinds of questions here, a local question and a global question. The local question is, what's the source of this particular behavioral norm? That is, why is it that, say, in my culture, when we meet, we shake hands, whereas in another culture that I spend some time in, when we meet, we bow, or another culture, when we meet, we put our hands together in a namaste. And so in each of those cultures, we want to talk about why that particular norm was instituted. And we can do that. But there's also a global question. Why is it that in all human cultures, we recognize some kinds of norms of etiquette, or more specifically, norms of greeting? And that's a very different kind of question. That's a kind of question about our fundamental psychology, about the way that we organize our social units, and the way that we maintain solidarity within those units so as to make them strong. So it's important to see that norms have a constitutive function in social groups. A lot of what I talk about in this book are important virtuous spirals that generate normativity and that are reinforced by and themselves are generated by normativity. So in order to have a successful culture, we need a lot of things. One thing that we need is a language, because you don't get culture without language. Another thing that we need is a code of ethics, because you've got to have behavioral stability so that people aren't just in random competition with one another. In a sufficiently complex culture, you may need legal and political norms. And you're, of course, going to need norms of etiquette in order to maintain social relations and so forth. Now, the cool thing is that once you've got those, you end up with a culture which is then capable of articulating those norms and ramifying them. When those norms are articulated, ramified, and integrated, they tighten the culture. When the culture gets tighter, it becomes easier to articulate those norms and easier to develop them and to enforce them. And norms are also self-correcting. Epistemic norms are a really good example there. Once we develop approaches to investigation, we might, for instance, start recognizing certain kinds of experts as people to whom we defer, or we might come to recognize certain kinds of experimental procedures as ones better likely to get us at the truth. And again, what that does is to ramify, to extend, and to enrich our set of norms. So one way to look at this, and this is a kind of frame that I use in the book. One of the things that distinguishes human beings from other species on Earth is that we're a hypersocial species. And when I say hypersocial, I don't just mean very social, but I mean we're a species in which who we are are beings who evolve to fit into human culture. And what human culture is the product of beings like us. So that we get this, again, a virtuous spiral where each of us is the product of lots of natural selection. But a lot of that natural selection is, in our case, selection to be culturally fit, to be able to function in ordinary human cultures, not just to be able to eat and reproduce, but to be able to interact successfully with others. Moreover, our cultures evolve in competition with other cultures. And as cultures evolve to be, they respond to demands that require social cohesion. And so we get cultures that are becoming more cohesive, that select individuals who fit better into those cultures, that make those cultures more cohesive, that select individuals who are going to be better in those cultures, and so forth. All of that requires a recognition of normativity per se across its domains, and the ability, even when we move between cultures, to detect the norms of different cultures in order to succeed in those arenas.
Yeah, great. So a lot of stuff we might talk about here. I mean, I do want to explore some of the evolutionary stuff in a little bit, but for now, maybe we could talk a little bit more about the more natural versus what we might call transcendent views of morality. and normativity. So like the picture you described there, I could see someone saying like, yeah, okay, we are these sorts of creatures with these regulatory mechanisms and behaviors, but all the same, when we're saying something like there's this norm or we should do this or that's the right sort of belief to form, we're getting at something that's kind of beyond that. There's maybe some sort of realm of facts or some sort of something almost divine in some sense that is the source of those normative facts. So, I mean, could you talk a little bit more about why you would reject that sort of approach to normativity? Yeah.
Sure. When you said almost divine, I would say, actually modeled on the divine. So let's take the example of morality, for instance, which is the one that most people think just simply has to be transcendent. That is, we couldn't possibly make that stuff up. And if we did, it would be totally contingent, non-binding. So suppose that we granted, for the sake of argument, that there is a deity. Who knows what his name is or her name is or where she lives, but there's a deity who gives us these rules. There's an immediate question that one needs to ask. Why in the world should we listen to what a deity says? I mean, after all, there might be a political person, a political officer, say a president or a king, who makes rules. And it might be that some of those rules are smart and some of those rules are dumb. But if somebody said, well, you've got to obey them because the president says so, or because the king says so, you can always ask the question, why should I obey that? And notice that the same thing is true if you think about this in terms of a divinity or any transcendent source. And you'll notice that this gets complicated real quick, because when we think about a God, for instance, and we think about how we model that God and that God's authority, let's take a look at the prayers that different people say. Things like, Our Father who art in heaven, right? Or Our Father, our King, if we go back to a Jewish liturgy, right? Whenever we do that, we personify that God in terms of somebody we already recognize to be authoritative. So we say, well, we should obey God because God's the Father. Now ask the question, why should we obey our fathers? Again, if your fathers are anything like my father, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. But the answer, you should do what I say because I say so, is decidedly unsatisfactory once you recognize fallibility. So if God is just our Father, just as fallible as any other father, again, why bother obeying that? And if you say we should obey our Father because God tells us to, honor thy father and thy mother, you find yourself arguing in a very, very tight circle. We should obey God because he's like a father. We should obey our Father because God says that we should. And we don't get out of that at all. And in fact, when we look at most theological or transcendental accounts of morality, they look very much like that. They give us a kind of command to which we've got some kind of immediate access. So when Kant, for instance, to keep coming back to this analogy, because Kant was so influential in this transcendental view of reality, when Kant talks about our direct intuition of the moral law, he's simply channeling Luther and Luther's view that each of us has direct access to the divine. And again, you could ask, all right, Kant, so I've got direct access to a moral law, and I find out what it is. Why should I obey it? What's the reason for doing so? And if I'm told, well, that's what it is to be human, I want to say, well, no. What it is to be human is to be a particular kind of animal that lives in a particular environment, in a particular niche. And when we look at that kind of normativity and then begin to ask ourselves of what genus is it a species, we recognize that it's a genus of this general species of our tendency to construct our societies on the basis of fairly uniform behavioral expectations and the ability to solidify and to stabilize those expectations in order to make our societies more cohesive, in order to create better environments in which we live, raise our children, reproduce, and thrive. And that to do that, we select one another as beings who can fit into those societies. And that strikes me as the kind of explanation that you want to give of a human institution. Notice that if we were trying to explain an institution, like, for instance, a court system, or an institution like an economy or a bank, we wouldn't begin with God. We wouldn't begin transcendentally. We'd say, here are the needs that this was developed to serve. And here's how those needs arose. And here's why these things serve it. The fact that they serve those needs is what gives them their stability. And that's true, I think, across the board.
Right. Well, I'm no fan of sort of divine approaches to morality. I thought I'd maybe mention a couple of responses that people have given or might give and see what you think. So if to the question of like, well, why should we listen to God? I mean, maybe that's a normative or moral question. And there's a fact about God or what God says or something that makes it true that you should listen to God or something like that. And oftentimes people will say things like, well, why is, in response to questions like, why is what God says good, right? Or why is what God wants good? Well, it's because something about him or his nature or something like that. Like William Lane Craig would say, what God commands is good because he is good or because he has a good nature or something along those lines. What do you think about that sort of reply? If that makes sense to you.
I think it's utterly question begging. Imagine that, for instance, you were in a courtroom and there was a witness whose testimony was in question. And so the attorney asks the witness, are you truthful? And the witness says, yes, I am. And the attorney now turns to the jury and says, you see, the witness himself has said that he's truthful, so we should believe everything that he says. You would want to say, wait a minute, we're operating in a very small circle here. And if we're told that we should obey God because God is good, and the reason God is good is because he gives us these rules we should obey, we're operating in a very, very tight circle as well. I do think that I think there's an independent question, right, about whether it makes sense to even talk about a God. Notice that we don't talk about a God when we talk in evolutionary theory or when we talk about physics or when we talk about chemistry. So to suddenly bring God in for human psychology and social science seems to be wildly arbitrary in the first place. But even if we did, the problem that God is supposed to be there to solve in this particular case is to explain the binding force of normativity. But if the only way that God can do that is by stipulation that we're bound to believe whatever God says, or because we're supposed to trust God because God says, hey, you should believe me, then I think we're begging the question from the start. That's not how you explain human behavior. That's not how you explain human social institutions. And normative institutions are human social institutions and the products of human behavior.
Right. Yeah. I mean, another response though might be to say, look, in some cases, at least, when people engage in normative thought and talk, they really are at least attempting to get at facts about God or something theological. I mean, I think about when people talk about sin and what things are mortal and venial sins, and I think there's a sense of normativity there, but it's sort of tied up with certain theological views or views about God and what he's revealed and commanded and things like that. Do you think that's right? Or do you think there's a sense in which at least some normative talk is like at least attempting to get at facts about God or his commandments or his revelation?
Well, I think that in religious communities, that's often true, that people run together the normative with the theological. The question, though, is whether in doing that, they say anything that actually succeeds in explaining where the normative comes from and why these norms are binding. And that's, I think, where that enterprise falls apart. It either feels arbitrary or it begs the question directly by already packing the normativity, the normative force into the edicts of God that we're trying to explain in the first place. Again, this is a version of Moore's old open question argument. When Moore pointed out that, whenever you point to some natural property of things, that it maybe is good for the greatest number, or that it makes people happy, or that it prevents suffering, you can still ask the question, but why is that good? And the point is the same with respect to a deity. You can point to what a deity says, but you can then always ask the question, yeah, but why should I care about that deity? And of course, as you know, there's already a plurality of deities around the world. And you've got to decide which one to believe when they say different things.
Yeah. I'm on the same page. I think that's not a sort of promising way to go in theorizing about normativity generally. I mean, maybe it's worth taking into consideration when thinking about some of the normative thought and talk, as you say, especially as it in religious communities more often. But and maybe as a sort of backdrop to our culture today more broadly in history, there's been some influence there, I'm sure. But yeah,
and note that we can explain that kind of behavior within my general framework, because religious communities are also norm-constituting communities. And so we can ask ourselves the question, what's the origin of religion and what's it doing? And we can answer that question naturalistically, to talk about the ways people take interpersonal relations and project them onto nature, the way people look for explanations that transcend the natural. But that's, again, a naturalistic explanation of where that comes from, that doesn't take for granted the truth of theology, but rather asks what its sources are. And I think that to the extent that we see theological systems as normative, we can see them like systems of etiquette, like systems of ethics, like legal systems, as systems that it's natural for human beings to create. But then we can ask exactly what function they serve.
Right. Great. So, I did want to, maybe you said some things about your view already, or your approach already, but I thought maybe it would be helpful to talk a little bit about Hume and what is Humeanism or neo-Humean approaches to normativity. I don't know, could you give a little bit of background there? Like, how did Hume approach this, and where are you taking his approach in your view?
Sure. And this goes back to an earlier book of mine on Hume's treatise called The Concealed Influence of Custom. So I'm trying to figure out where to get started. I'll tell you where to get started. Hume was the guy who got me to fall in love with philosophy. And so I've orbited around Hume for much of my life. And I had the great good fortune to study at the University of Pittsburgh under a great Hume scholar, Annette Beyer, to whom I owe a great deal of whatever I get right about this. Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, that's the title of the text. It was very much that. It was a treatise about human nature. And what Hume was trying to explore was what it is that makes us human, and what it is about us that allows us to, and forces us to construct the norm-governed systems in which we live. And he examined a number of different ideas that we've evolved to have. The idea that we have a self pointed out that that's a mistake, that we should be thinking of ourselves as persons, not as selves, as beings constituted by our social relations. He looked at the notion of causality and recognized that while we give causal explanations, causal powers or forces are things that we don't find in nature. Rather, we find customs or conventions regarding how to do science and how to explain things. He argued that we imbue our social institutions, our governments, and our moral institutions with a particular kind of authority, but in fact we're often mistaking our own sentiments and the sentiments we've evolved to have and that we generate in one another for this transcendent force. And so it was really looking at Hume's analysis of the fundamental contingency of human norms and values that got me intrigued by this. I think of the Treatise of Human Nature as maybe the oldest Western text on cognitive science. And of course, Hume gets some things right and some things wrong, and some things he never gets anywhere near. But what he was trying to do was to introduce a science of human nature. Now, of course, Kant came along and criticized Hume, and those critiques have defined a lot of subsequent philosophy, arguing that Hume couldn't account for necessity, that he couldn't account for moral necessity, he couldn't account for causal necessity, he couldn't account for epistemic necessity, because all he could do was talk about how we are contingently and how the world is, and to account for the necessity that Kant saw in all of these, we needed to make a transcendental move. Now, people have argued back and forth about that for quite a long time. And as I say, I think that for a long time, the naturalistic perspective was in ascendancy as science marched forwards. And then in the kind of era where human rights became very important, Kant became very important, and we began to get this Kantian turn. And so when I grew up in philosophy, we learned about Hume primarily as Kant's whipping boy, that Hume looked like he could explain things, and Kant showed that no, there's important things about science, important things about knowledge, important things about perception, important things about morality that Hume can't explain because all of these require necessity. Now, I want to come back to Hume and say, no, actually, Hume got it right, because the necessity that Kant thought we needed to explain isn't actual necessity, but our perception of necessity. Not actual necessity, but the way in which we represent regularities to ourselves. And it's Hume who can explain that. And that's why I call this a neo-Humean account of the sources of normativity. I have enormous respect for Rawls and Korsgaard and their not rehabilitation, but their adumbration of the Kantian approach to understanding morality and to understanding politics. But I guess I think it's fundamentally wrong. And it's fundamentally wrong because it locates the source of normativity someplace outside of us. Hume pointed out beautifully in the treatise that human beings are, as he put it, natural artificers. That is, it's natural for us to make things. And one of the things that we make are our societies. The most important thing that we make are ourselves. We've constructed who we are by constructing social environments as niches in which we evolve. And so we've constructed our normative nature by constructing cultures that require a recognition of normativity in order to survive, and cultures that are then strengthened by that recognition. And it's understanding that constant spiral of self-construction that I think is Hume's very deepest insight. Another way to put that, Hume was deeply influenced by Bernard Mandeville. And Bernard Mandeville, of course, is famous for his fable of the bees. And there's a lot about that is very tongue-in-cheek. But one thing that Mandeville got right, and that Hume saw very clearly, you don't explain how a beehive works by first figuring out how a bee works and then multiplying that by 10,000. You figure out how a bee works by figuring out how a beehive works and what you have to do to function as part of that unit. And Hume had the same insight with respect to human culture. You don't figure out how Australia works by figuring out how one Australian operates, then multiplying by a few million. You figure out what it is to be an Australian by figuring out how Australia works and what you have to be to fit into that culture. And that, I think, is kind of revolutionary because it suggests a naturalistic understanding of culture can give us a naturalistic understanding of the denizens of culture. And by understanding the denizens of culture, we reciprocally come to understand how that culture is created. And at each level, we have the individuals determining the collective and the collective determining the nature of the individuals. And the common core there is the recognition of norms.
Yeah.
And I think that the great evolutionary moment when it occurred was our evolution for language.
Yeah. Do you think that the development of language came before norms, or do you think you could have sort of norms even prior to language or anything that we would call language?
I don't think we get anything we would recognize as human normativity in this kind of evolving spiral until you've got language. And I think when we evolve for language, we evolve to recognize rules. We evolved to recognize linguistic rules. We also evolved to trust those who raise us in order to, and those in our culture, to think of them as teachers of those rules. So because, again, it's important when you're learning a language, not just to have universal grammar. Universal grammar, you're all dressed up with no place to go. You've also got to be able to recognize the regularities in the behavior of those around you and use that as the data to figure out what your language is among all the languages that are made possible by universal grammar. So that evolution for language and the evolution for mutual trust and recognition of others as teachers work together to give us the basis of our existence as normative animals.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think about, like, this is not something I know much about myself, but in, say, other animals, in present day or in history, like, well, okay, maybe none of them have something sort of approaching human normativity, but maybe, I don't know, maybe some of the other great apes do, like chimpanzees and gorillas to some degree. I mean, would you say that there are other? No.
Chimpanzees and gorillas don't. They've got the ability to recognize behavioral regularities. They've got dominance hierarchies, but dominance hierarchies aren't normative. Dominance hierarchies are coercive. And one way to look at this is that human beings are the only species in which we get third-party norm enforcement. So in a dominance hierarchy, if you are a dominant figure and I'm a subordinate figure, and I try to do something you don't like, you can beat up on me and not vice versa. But we don't get the phenomenon that you beat up on me unjustly and somebody else steps in and says, whoa, don't beat up on Garfield, he was okay. Third-party enforcement is absolutely absent. And it's third-party enforcement that really gives you the key or the clue that you've got a normative system, that other people are representing the justice or the injustice, the appropriateness or the inappropriateness, the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of what's being done. And that's absent in every other primate clade. And the evolution from to norm-governed hierarchies is what makes it possible to have stable societies, to pass things on.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm sort of under the impression that at least maybe it's not fully normative, but there's like some sort of features kind of reminiscent of what we would call norm-governed behavior, but maybe it wouldn't count. I'm not sure.
Maybe think of those as evolutionary precursors of normativity, but they're not themselves normative institutions. You get normative institutions when we begin to see regularities as binding, when we begin to see them binding on all of us, and when we begin to see each of us not only as a follower of norms and an institutor of norms, but an enforcer of norms. And it's when that happens that you get the glue that's able to create the societies that create us, who can then create societies and so forth. And once you're off on that spiral, you've got a genuinely normative species.
Yeah. I mean, I did want to ask more about this notion of binding, and you mentioned earlier sort of authority or authoritativeness. Some people have thought that in order to really have morality with or normativity with that feature, that it's really authoritative, that it's in some senses has sort of it's a sort of correct guide to how you should act or whatever the particular normative domain is, and you're sort of beholden to that in some sense. That can be difficult to make more precise what that means, but that some people think that that's a sort of feature that's kind of strange if normativity is just, I don't know, some sort of evolved trait between Homo sapiens or creatures like that. So yeah, maybe could you talk a little bit more about authority and bindingness and like the worry that it's like doesn't seem to fit well with normativity being some sort of evolved feature or social feature.
Yeah, and of course that's a version of Kant's critique of Hume, who says Hume might be able to account for regularities, but he can't account for the fact that we take those regularities to be binding on us. Now, the question then that you want to ask of the Kantian or the neo-Kantian is two. One, do you think that the account of why these are binding should be a natural account, scientific account, or a non-scientific account? If it's a non-scientific account, you've got to ask why this feature of human beings is the one feature that escapes scientific explanation, and that begins to sound weird. So if you think it's a scientific account, then you've got to be really clear about what it is that you want to explain. And what you want to explain is why we enforce norms, why we institute norms, and why each of us comes to recognize those norms as something binding on us. So notice that what I'm doing here is not explaining the fact that they're binding, but explaining the fact that we manage to construct institutions that represent them as binding, and why we evolve as beings who represent them as binding. Now, the answer to that is pretty simple. If you have a pattern of behavior, a set of behavioral regularities and expectations that you expect to be stable, you've got to be a species that is going to A, be sensitive to those regularities, and B, naturally conform to them. So one way to look at it is the feeling of bindingness is our feeling that those norms that those practices are ones in which we are compelled to perform, which we're compelled to participate. So let's take a look at it in the context of language, first of all. I mean, because a lot of people don't like to think about language when they think about normativity, but that's kind of the home of normativity. So when you're learning the syntax of your language, so if you're learning English, and you learn that basically the subject generally comes first, and verbs have to agree in number with their subjects and so forth, you don't just learn, gee, people talk like this. That's a really cool way to talk. Maybe I'll talk like that too, or maybe I won't. If you're the kind of being who responds to a linguistic environment like that, you're never going to become a language user. You're not going to live to reproduce. You're not going to succeed in the pickup bars. And the genes that make you incapable of recognizing those rules as binding are not going to propagate in the population. If, on the other hand, you're the kind of being who says, everybody else is talking like this, I ought to talk like this too, that is that you're brought up with the feeling of necessity, whether or not there's any other source of that necessity, then you are going to be the kind of being who's going to be a successful cooperator. You're going to have success in the pickup bars. You're going to reproduce, and you're going to enable your kids to learn to grow, to learn language, and to reproduce. All that requires is not a transcendental source of obligation to obey linguistic rules. What it requires is the psychological disposition to regard those rules as binding and to conform your own behavior to them, and to teach those rules to your progeny. Now, what goes for language goes for ethics, goes for politics, goes for maybe aesthetics, goes for epistemology as well. Yes, you've got to come to feel those rules as binding, but what's important is that feeling. And that's something Hume made so abundantly clear when he was talking about ethics. It's our moral sentiments that are important, and what those sentiments get us to do, not some transcendental requirement. So this is a story about how these propensities are maintained and reproduced and favored in society. And that's a simple evolutionary explanation of how these normative institutions come to be and how we come to be as participants in those institutions. And it requires no transcendental source, only a feeling of being bound.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, but I could imagine, sort of, a lot of people might worry though that by saying that it's a feeling that's required or that's sufficient here of being bound, or that there's some sort of authoritativeness to these norms. Well, you're not explaining actually how there are those norms. In fact, in some sense, there are those features of authority and bindingness. In a way, maybe there aren't, right? It's just the sort of feeling that we have. So is that maybe sort of just rejecting that there is authority and bindingness in the first place?
No.
Or yeah, how would you respond to that?
No, it's explaining what that authority and bindingness is. And it's explaining it as a socially constructed and evolved sensitivity, and a socially constructed and evolved feeling of obligation, and a socially constructed and evolved tendency to enforce and to participate in the norms that we recognize. That's what normativity is. And so, in a way, you might see this as a deflationary account of normativity, but it deflates it into something that makes sense of our evolutionary psychology and of our essentially social nature, and doesn't require a kind of bit of magic or relation to something extraterrestrial in order to do it. It's an account of human nature. That's what's Humean about it.
Right. Yeah. I do want to bring up a couple other worries that people might have. One, well,
sure.
Maybe it has to do with moral epistemology or normative epistemology. Like a lot of people think that, or at least a lot of people in philosophy think that maybe one of the important ways to come to understand the normative truths, especially the moral ones, is by reflecting or thinking about what sort of moral intuitions that we have. And some people might report that the sort of intuitions they have, that seems to be like it doesn't really matter what the features of humans are or the normative institutions that we've developed in our history or something like that. Be those as they may, like I can just intuit and reflect and intuit that I don't know, such and such is wrong or such and such is right. So what do you think about that? I guess there's multiple thoughts going on there. One is that people seem to have the sense that the normative facts sort of should be largely independent of these human institutions and behaviors and regulatory practices. And two, that like at least one of the important ways that we come to understand these things is by just reflecting and exploring our moral intuitions, our normative intuitions more generally. What do you think?
Yeah. You're right that we often use our moral intuitions as guides to moral judgment and guides to our behavior. There are several things to say about that. One is it's important to see that moral intuitions vary more than people think that they vary. They vary across cultures, and within cultures, they often vary among individuals. To take, just a crude example, my intuition is that copyright theft is a really bad thing. Most of my students see it as a perfectly terrific thing to do because it's undermining the hegemony of publishing companies and making information available to everybody. Now, if we just consult our moral intuitions, there's not going to be any way to resolve that. That's going to require some discussion about our moral practices, our social practices, our economic practices, and so forth. So one thing to say is that moral intuitions are not infallible guides to anything. Rather, what they do is they recognize or they reflect the set of customs and conventions and social patterns into which we've been socialized. And of course, moral intuitions vary between cultures as well. So you might have one culture that values freedom as an important human attribute. Another culture we might value deference to authority as a really important human trait. So you can't use intuitions as a guide to anything other than the enculturation of the individual who has the intuitions. The second thing to say is that intuitions are psychological states. And as psychological states, they require psychological explanations. And those explanations can come from all kinds of places. They might have to do with upbringing. They may have to do with the books one has read or the people to whom one has spoken or other kinds of experiences in life. That's naturalistic. My suggestion in my own account of morality in this book is that that we need a relatively uniform set of moral intuitions in any society to ensure stability. But there are many different stable equilibria. And all you need is to have some stable equilibrium in order for ethics to work. Not every candidate moral system might lead you to that equilibrium, but any equilibrium will do. And again, the analogy there is with language. If somebody were to ask, what's the correct language? Is it English, Japanese, or Russian? You'd want to look at them like they're out of their mind. Different cultures develop different languages. But if you're in a culture and you ask, is this sentence grammatically correct? That's fixed by the strictures of that culture. So I think the same thing is true about morality. There are different moral codes that each can lead to social cohesion. That's a kind of modest relativism. It doesn't mean anything goes, but it does mean that the goal of a moral system is social cohesion, and that requires that individuals in the society be able to recognize that code as something to which they can have allegiance, and that code actually works to keep things going. So I think when we talk about intuitions, we need to be able to always be willing to explain them, and explaining them comes back to practices, and practices comes back to the kind of Humean account of normativity that I'm after.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like I could sort of imagine there's some story to tell about what sort of creature we are and our psychology and our history and our upbringing that we would explain, at least in part, why we have the sort of quote unquote intuitions that we do. And that I think that could be sort of fit into your account as I'm understanding it.
Yeah. And that also explains why we take those intuitions so seriously. And that's fine. I mean, but what we have to explain is where they come from, why we take them seriously, and how they function, not how they manage to get us to a superhuman moral truth.
Yeah, and then another thing, you mentioned that on your approach, there's a sort of moderate relativism. It's not like anything goes, and it's what you call this sort of stable maxima, maybe at least locally, or maybe there's not, even if there's not a global sort of ideal package of norms or something like that. There's sort of stable ones that lead to social cohesion, or otherwise sort of facilitate the population to flourish and to survive and pass along the sort of practices that they have. But well, two things. One, oftentimes, I think a lot of people would say that, well, we can still judge, say, morally, the actions of some group that's operating under a different collection of norms, even if they're succeeding, quote unquote, with those norms, so to speak. So, what do you think about? And that seems to be a kind of sort of anti-relativist intuition, or you might think it is, but maybe not. Or what do you think about that?
I think that's an interesting feature about morality that, again, distinguishes it from language. None of us say, oh, gee, they speak the wrong language. We kind of recognize linguistic relativity as appropriate. Now, notice that, say, political systems are somewhere intermediate there. Some people might say, gee, that's an abhorrent political system. Other people might say, well, if they actually like that political system, let them have it, right? And we're seeing a lot of that in contemporary discourse. Where there are questions about, is it legitimate to interfere in the politics of another country? Somebody says, well, gee, they're deeply oppressive, so we should. Other people say, no, there's just multiple ways to organize society, and we should be tolerant of diversity there. Because morality is a domain in which norms are felt so very deeply, I think that we are even more likely to be intolerant of moral diversity than we are of political diversity, and certainly a lot less willing to tolerate it than we are of linguistic diversity. But I think that we need to come to recognize that, A, we do tolerate moral diversity to some extent, and B, maybe we should tolerate it to a greater extent than we do. We certainly, because morality is such an important domain of normativity in our societies, we feel it very deeply. But it's that feeling of it very deeply that we need to explain rather than the uniqueness of our own moral system. So somebody who grows up in a broadly libertarian Western democracy might be appalled by the moral intuition of some who grow up in a Confucian society. But those in a Confucian society are often equally appalled by what they see as the craziness of broadly libertarian societies. And we have to kind of recognize that both of those positions are explicable because within each society, that set of norms is so important in maintaining stability. But also that because it's explicable doesn't mean that it's right, and that we need to be a little bit more tolerant of other equilibria that other folks have managed to attain.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Earlier you brought up, you mentioned Moore's sort of open question argument, where it seems like, at least for many views, and you don't even need to apply this just to naturalist views, but for many views about what fixes the normative facts, especially the moral facts, it seems like a sort of open question. If you said that X fixes the normative facts, or this is what makes something bad or good or right or wrong, or what other normative valence that it has, seems like a further question. As a competent speaker of the language, it doesn't seem incoherent or trivial to ask, well, why is X good, or why is X what fixes that normative feature? And I could see someone asking the same thing about your approach here. I mean, what do you think if someone says, yeah, but look, there are these collections of rule governed behavior or practices and so on are effective at producing social cohesion and surviving and proliferating and so on. But why are they good? Or why are they the right norms, so to speak, or a collection of correct norms? Like, what do you think about that? Yeah.
I would just say that's kind of begging the question, and it's actually asking the wrong question. My account is an account of the sources of normativity and of how we came to be the normative animal who builds societies grounded in norms. I'm not arguing that that was the best possible outcome in the world, or that was the telos of evolution, or that somehow we should valorize this as, say, over the lives of ants or the lives of fish. Rather, what I'm doing is exploring what it is to be a human being. And those are the kind of beings that we are. So it's a bit of a natural history. And what I'm trying to do is to replace the impetus for transcendental understandings of who we are with natural understandings of who we are. I think that if we're honest about the kind of being that we are, we're not a little spark of the divine. We're just a pretty interestingly evolved bit of nature. And that's the way that we need to understand what it is to be human. In the end of the book, I kind of ask the question, are we created in the image of God, or is God created in our own image? And I say it's much more likely it's the latter. And so you're not going to be able to explain who we are by going outside of the scientific image. You've got to explain who we are within that image, and then to explain how it is that we construct something that is so rich and so beautiful that it allows us to create the institutions that make our lives possible.
Yeah. And speaking of creating the institutions that make our lives possible, you also in the book talk about, and I think you mentioned this briefly already, that, well, sometimes we need, in order to solve sort of larger scale or coordination problems, this has led to, and maybe it inevitably led to something like this for social creatures of ours that are as complex as us and as numerous as us, the development of political and legal norms. So, I mean, can you talk a little bit maybe about how that works on your view, and why you think things like social contract theory get it backward?
Yeah. So there's two questions there. One is a question about why construct social and legal norms. And the second is what's wrong with social contract theory. The answer to the first one is real simple. As long as you've got a fairly small band of individuals, you don't need political and legal norms. Basically, moral norms, linguistic norms, and group epistemic norms and so forth are enough to keep that band together. But as soon as the band gets large and you get to the size of a town or a city or a nation, then informal shared understandings aren't going to be sufficient to generate the kinds of expectations of stability and to manage conflict and so forth that's necessary to maintain stability of a larger society. Then you need to divide labor, and you've got to have people whose job it is to codify the regularities that we expect, to end up with institutional punishment rather than individual punishment, and to raise the resources that are required in order for a large community to be stable with division of labor and division of responsibilities. So legal and political norms evolve as a result of size. You don't need them if there's 8 or 10 of us, or maybe even 20 of us. But if there's 20,000 of us, and some people are farming, and some people are manufacturing, and some people are lending money, and some people are borrowing money, and so forth, now all of a sudden you need regulations to maintain stability. Now, what does social contract theory get wrong about that? Social contract theory asks us why those political norms that we institute are binding. And it says, well, here's why. Because they come from either, now there's 2 versions of this, right? There's the really dumb version, which is the historical version that says once upon a time, our ancestors got together and said we can't keep living as independent wild people in the wilderness. Life's going to be better for us if we stop fighting with one another for resources, and we make an agreement that we all agree to that's going to create peace and stability and prosperity. And that because our ancestors made that agreement long, long, long ago, we are bound by that agreement as their heirs, and so to respect the institutions that they created. Well, we know what's wrong with that. A, there never was such a contract. B, even if there was, descendants can't be bound by it. And C, there was never a period of a state of nature where human beings were just individuals living in isolation and then happened to come together to form a community. But there's also a different version of that. There's what we might call the hypothetical contract version, which is much more interesting. The version that Kant and Rawls and Locke are responsible for. And that is to say, if we imagine humans in a state of nature, living individually or in small bands and competing wildly with one another for resources, and then we imagine them coming together and forming a contract and an agreement to form a society like ours, then we would say, yes, that's a good thing. We would agree to that and would be bound by it. And so because we now agree that that would be a good thing, we should take ourselves as bound by political norms. That might sound a little better, but it's actually no better at all. For one thing, imagine going into court and suing somebody for breach of contract, and that person saying, but we never made this contract. And you said, no. But suppose we had. If we had, it would have been such a great contract that we'd all be bound by it. So I think we are bound by it now, so I'm suing you for breach. You'd be laughed out of court. Actual contracts are binding. Hypothetical contracts are not. But moreover, the very bindingness of contracts, the idea that promises and signatures and so forth are binding, is already a social institution that depends upon a structure of social norms. So even if historically or hypothetically we imagined people coming from a non-existent state of nature and creating a contract, the creation of that contract would have no normative force because there's no institution of contracts present. Instead, as Hume pointed out, contracts get their power from an antecedent set of norms in which we practice. You can't explain norms by reference to a contract. Instead, we explain contracts by reference to a standing structure of norms. So social contract theory is an utter non-starter in explaining political or moral normativity.
Right. Yeah, I see where you're going there. Yeah, the contract even gets its sort of normative force from the fact that we have these norms in the first place that we've already constructed, not the contract itself.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and that should have been the end of social contract theory. I mean, Hume's argument is so devastating that should have been the end of it. Unfortunately, it's not.
Yeah. I was just thinking, what would you say to someone who's more of like a normative skeptic? Like maybe they grant to you that, okay, we behave in all these ways. Our evolutionary history is as standardly believed to be, and so on. But none of that's really normativity. And, none of that really exists. All this authority and bindingness, it's all either unclear or just false. Especially, I could imagine someone saying this if they think that, well, in order for normativity to exist, it would have to be something sort of transcendent. And since there isn't anything like that, and maybe they accept your remarks about that, they just deny, or at least they're skeptical of normativity altogether. What do you think about that attitude?
I'd say that position is deeply self-undermining and self-defeating, because in making the argument, they're relying on epistemic norms. In making the argument in language, they're relying on linguistic norms, and they're expecting their interlocutor to abide by the same norms that they are, if their interlocutor is going to understand them, that is the linguistic norms, and in order to accept the force of the argument, that is in the epistemic norms. So the argument itself presupposes the reality of norms. And again, you could ask that person, well, given that, say, money is something that is only constituted by a set of social norms, and you think that social norms aren't real, if there's any, currency notes in your pocket, could you kind of like just hand them to me, since they don't exist as money anyway? Do you, and so forth. I mean, it's just that the fact is that we live in a social nexus that we construct, and that we construct through normativity. And there's no external fulcrum position from which you can criticize it, because the moment you try to criticize it, you're appealing to norms in the first place. This is a position that's actually made beautifully in the Zhuangzi, great Chinese classic, where Zhuangzi says, it's better to use a non-point than a point to show that a point is not a point. And what he means by that is, if you want to show that arguments don't have any force, if you really want to make that kind of skeptical argument, you've got to either you use an argument or a non-argument. If you use an argument, you've defeated your own position. If you use a non-argument, then if it's supposed to convince somebody, it's got to be an argument. And so you can't escape this kind of structure of normativity in order to criticize it. That's the human condition. That's what it is for us to be normative animals.
Good. Yeah, actually, I like this sort of way of thinking about normativity, just as sort of kind of demystifying it in a sort of way. Like, it's sort of explaining how it's already rife within our psychology and practice. And so if you want to come and deny it, I mean, this is sort of, it's hard to imagine that you could consistently do that given your other attitudes, especially when even just saying that or denying it. Although in response, I could imagine someone saying, okay, I accept what these features that you're calling norms exist, but that's not what I'm calling normativity. So maybe use a different word. Because if someone just had in mind, say, by normativity, something that had to be transcendent, then they would say, well, maybe there's no normativity in that sense, even if there is quote unquote normativity in your intended sense. Does that make sense, or what do you think about that? If they just say, yeah, we're capturing different things.
Again, I would have to agree. I'd say, yes, I'm demystifying normativity. I'm showing that it's a natural, social, psychological phenomenon, and that every aspect of the normative domain to which you could point can be explained naturalistically in this way. That makes the transcendental move ad hoc. It makes it a fifth wheel, and it shows just how question-begging it is. Again, it would be as though somebody said, yes, you can point to currency and see that some of it's paper and some of it's metal and some of it's stored in electronic records in banks. But what I want is the value. What makes that dollar note worth $1? What makes that 50-cent piece worth 50 cents? And you can't do that by just pointing to metal and paper and electronic records and the behavior of people. That has to reflect an antecedent value in currency. You want to say to them, you're nuts. The value in currency comes from what people do with it. It's not that we suddenly discovered money lying around on the beach and said, wow, this is valuable stuff you can buy stuff with. We had to construct it. Nor did we find norms lying around on the beach or in heaven, and then say, wow, we can make use of these. We constructed them. As I said earlier, Hume's great insight is that not only are we natural artificers, but the greatest artifact we ever constructed are ourselves and the normative structures that make it possible for us to exist.
Yeah, that's really good. And you sort of talked about this a little bit already, but I wanted to ask, to what degree do you think certain cross-cultural work or historical work is important for theorizing or understanding normativity generally?
I think it's hugely important, not just for understanding normativity, but in philosophy generally. Anybody who thinks that any single tradition in the world gives us all the insight we need is out of their minds, whether that's Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy or Mesoamerican philosophy or Western philosophy. Each one of them has got value. Each one of them's got insights. But you really end up being kind of myopic if you keep only live within one tradition. My own work, I've been emphasizing the Humean roots, but a lot of it comes out of my study of Buddhist philosophy, and some of it comes out of my study of Taoist philosophy as well. And I think that it's your philosophical insight's going to be sharpened by a richer array of arguments, ideas, and metaphors.
Yeah, perfect. I definitely agree with that. One thing you talk about a bit in the book is the importance of trust. How do you think trust is relevant or especially important in normativity on your approach?
Yeah. Now, one thing I do is I distinguish trust from reliability, from reliance. There are things that we can rely on because we see them as regular and see them as dependable. You might rely on your car, you might rely on the weather forecast, or so forth. But trust is different. Trust involves a kind of attribution of goodwill and common purpose to people. I can rely on somebody who I don't trust at all. I could rely on them to deceive me or to betray me. And I could even trust somebody on whom I can't rely. That is, I can say, she always ends up coming late or screwing things up, but she's a really good friend and I know her heart's in the right place. I can trust her. And so when I talk about trust, I'm talking about this presumption of decency and goodwill among us. And you don't notice it, but it's ubiquitous. When you walk down the street, you're not constantly on your guard thinking people are going to attack you or to steal from you. When you cross the street at the light, you're trusting drivers not to have fun hunting people with their cars. When you go to the shop and you buy something, when you hand the money over, you're trusting that they're going to give you the goods in return. Trust is just all over the place. And when we go to a different culture or a different country and we ask directions to, a hotel or a museum or a restaurant, and somebody starts talking to us, we trust them to be honest with us. And so I think the trust kind of undergirds the whole possibility of social cohesion that allows us to construct norms, and that it's our evolution to trust one another, not only to rely on one another. It's a deep part of what makes us human. And that when we really look at what the foundations of the possibility of our normative structures are, they're mutual trust. And I think it's something that's easy to overlook. And when bonds of trust break down, society breaks down. Much more than when bonds of reliability break down. You can remonstrate with somebody who's unreliable but trustworthy. But when somebody is continually betraying trust, they kind of put themselves outside of your normative community.
Just to recap there then, like, trust is very important because it sort of enables us to sort of treat these norms and as, how would you put it exactly? Sorry, you cut out for me, so I didn't hear most of what you said at the end.
Yeah. Trust creates the bonds that make it possible for us to institute norms by presupposing that all of the others around us are abiding by the same norms and that are committed to them as we are. And it's that presumption of commitment to them and commitment to common purpose that makes it possible for us to work with others to construct normative structures. If we couldn't trust others, we couldn't bind each other in these normative communities.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, I do want to wrap up in a little bit, but I wanted to a couple more things before we finish up. I mean, you've been sort of explaining your view and defending against objections throughout, but I wonder if you could just maybe like in a sentence or two, how would you answer the question, like, what is a norm?
Yeah. A norm is a pattern of behavior to which all members or most members of a community are committed, and to which by which they feel their behavior constrained, and that they expect others to respect as well, and are willing to enforce when it's violated.
Yeah, fair enough. I just wanted to have that. I think that's a good way to put it. It seems like a plausible approach to me. But yeah, I do normally end with a kind of more general metaphilosophical question. So if that's all right, I was wondering what you think is the value of philosophy. Like, why is philosophy worth doing? Maybe for you, or more generally as a community, what makes philosophy valuable?
Yeah, philosophy, I think, allows us to gain a deeper insight into who we are, into what makes our human life worth living, and it allows us to develop a sense of our place in culture and history, and an attitude of gratitude towards those who have come before us, and a commitment to try to make the world a better one for those who come after us. I think philosophy sensitizes us to our own humanity and to the humanity of others.
Yeah, fair enough. I definitely agree with that.
And it's fun.
yeah. Good. Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, great. I think I'll draw the questions to a close there. But thanks so much for coming on, Professor Garfield, and writing this book and taking my questions. It's been really great having you.
Well, thank you. It's been a real joy talking with you, and I hope that others find our conversation interesting or useful. Thank you so much.